I had a dating website. I posted a picture of my dog to try to, entice the of-age honeys. Like, hey. And, well, the online dating didn't work out, so I deleted the profile. Fucking bring it, pussy. You ain't my real father.
Radio Free Innsmouth. What do we do on here?
분기반장을 잘했었어.
That's right, metal analysis. Not really a metal critic because I pretty much only talk about bands I like to keep my blood pressure down.
저는 여기서
Okay, yeah, there's also jokes. That's co-host Chan. I'm Jub. This week, we are going to be discussing a band who I started getting into heavily, quite recently as a matter of fact, because they were mentioned by both Glen Benton of Deicide and Vital Remains and Mike Browning of Nocturnus and Morbid Angel as an excellent and highly underrated 80s metal act. We're talking about
Exorcist.
From New York City, New York. They put out one album in 1986. It had Jamie Locke on bass. It had Jeff Fontaine on drums. It had Mark Dorian on guitars. And it had on vocals there. Damien Rath, everybody. And if you believe all that malarkey, I've got a bridge located in Exorcist's home city of New York to sell you. Because guess what? When it comes to all of those names, that lineup, that band history...
We made this one up. It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It never happened. It never happened. This one was invented by a
Canadian record label.
That's right. A record label from Toronto put together a band of fake members that never actually existed. And they put out a fake album. The name of that record label? Cobra Records, bro!
Hey, newsflash, dickweed.
Now, this isn't an entirely unique occurrence within metal. It's happened a couple times. The most notable time would probably be the particularly scummy case of the label Metal Enterprises from Germany, who had signed kind of like a hair metal band called Killer Fox. And then half of that band died in a car crash. But a couple years after that, a new Killer Fox album comes out, and well...
근데 솔직히 어느 정도 맞는 것 같긴 해요.
Yeah, something tells me that's not actually Killer Fox. That might just be some German record label boss fucking around, pretending to be a hair metal band that nobody knew about anyways, and yikes. Yeah, it's probably not worth torturing our listeners with any more of that. But if you can find Killer Fox's Orgasm of Death, holy shit, that is possibly the worst metal album of all time. Sort of a minor underground legend in that respect. However, Exorcist, despite not actually being a real band, did in fact put out some really good music, and that's because the two main guys behind the band are David DeFice and Edward Persino from Virgin Steele, a super duper old school heavy metal band. One of the first power metal bands. They're from New York, and they're kind of like the intellectual counterpart to Manowar in some ways. They're still around today, and nowadays they sound like this. Yeah, it's a progressive power metal with some seriously intense vocals and quite a bit of guitar shredding and keyboards and just lots of 2-disc concept albums about Greek tragic plays from back in the BCs. They're that kind of band. But they've been around since the 80s. They're so old, they've actually influenced Metallica quite a bit. If you read really old interviews with the guys, they enjoyed the second Virgin Steele album quite a bit. And back then, they were kind of like a much smarter version of Manowar without being too overly, like, floofy or intellectual. This is one of their best-known songs. It's called The Burning of Rome. It's off their fourth album. And it's great. Good stuff. One of the first bands to heavily utilize keyboards. They called their style Barbaro Romantic Metal. Also worth noting, this dude has a I think like a 4.5 octave range or something. His sister is like an internationally recognized opera singer, so I think that runs in the family. I might end up doing an episode on these guys at some point because, as you can tell, this shit's pretty fucking good. You know, see what I mean? It's still got balls to it. It's still heavy. Great riffs. Solid all around, especially their third and fourth albums, if you ask me. How cool is that? It almost sounds like it'd be on like an ex-Japan album or something, man. Alright, but here's where it gets really wacky, folks. So the Cobra record label boss goes to Edward Persino and David DeFeist and is like, hey, do you want to like make some fake bands for me? And so they're like, well, okay, I guess. Persino had actually just joined Virgin Steele at this point. He was originally with a Canadian band called Pile Driver, but he's not on the first Pile Driver album. He shows up in the second one. And the second Pile Driver album is also kind of a fake band. It's still got Gordon Kitchen on vocals, but the guitars are all Persino, and then the album itself was actually written entirely by David DeFeist from Virgin Steele. For being what's essentially a fake album, this is by far my favorite Pile Driver release. It's very heavy, evil speed metal. So it's repetitive, it's simple, it's catchy, and extremely lethal in terms of what it could do to your neck if you start headbanging to it. Actually, a lot of Pile Driver stuff was a big influence in some of the more heavy metal inclined Swedish black metal guys like Niflheim and Gehenna and whatnot. But yeah, that's David DeFeist. So with that album, he proves that, hey man, I can do this fake band thing for you, Mr. Cobra Guy. You don't even have to tell anybody that's me. We'll do pseudonyms and all that. And so he's like, hell yeah, brother. Or whatever the Canadian equivalent of that is. So he gives us this Exorcist album. Nobody knew who was actually behind this band for years. People were like, who the fuck is Damien Wrath? And then it comes out, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago that it was David DeFeist doing the whole thing. So there's a bit of mystique because of all the mystery behind it. Also because it's extremely hard to get after it went out of print, or it was. Luckily now it has been reissued in a massive 2-CD set, which is a calling card of David DeFeist's. All the Virgin Steele albums are like that. And it's got 3 different versions of the album. Version 1, entitled The Father, is a fairly faithful reproduction with lots of 80s style reverb on it. Still, you know, it doesn't have the same level of hissiness as the original album, but I think it feels exceptionally dark and 80s sounding. So I would say if you're a purist, that's probably the one to go with. Sounds good to me. Next. Second version of the album, entitled The Sun, is remastered by David DeFeist. It's a bit clearer and sharper. The mix is more balanced. You don't have those like hissy cymbals quite as much. The guitars are a bit more forward as opposed to the overpowering vocals of the other remaster on here. This one's probably my preferred version. And then you have The Unholy Spirits, which is entirely remixed from the original sources. Instrumental separation is at its height, so you can hear the bass exceptionally well. Everything has been considerably cleaned up. Some people might say it's going a bit too far with the remixing, but hey, that's why the dude gives you fucking 3 different versions of it. And they're all pretty good. And they're all on like one thing, so you can't complain like, oh, he fucked the album up because you got like 2 other versions listed. This stuff is exceptionally evil sounding for 1986, and it still sounds pretty darn sinister today, if you ask me.
아니야, 나는 촛불부장이야.
Huh? Are you saying that they might, in fact, have ripped off a Hellhammer song there? I think that just shows how dedicated they were to making a very evil album, though. Hellhammer was obscure as fuck back then. And the fact that these like wacky power metal guys knew about it enough to maybe lift a riff or two indicates they were pretty intent on making this an exceptionally evil sounding album. Speed metal! Good stuff, man. This is what speed metal sounds like. Except for the vocals. The vocals are out of this world strange. Maybe some of the earliest examples of something resembling a death growl. Which explains why the guy from Nocturnus and the guy from Deicide said they enjoyed this album. Apparently it also influenced Morbid Angel in general a little bit. Nice little bar chord riff there too, showing some of their progressive power metal roots. Like that's a bit too pretty for a normal speed metal album, especially one that is this dedicated to sounding that fucking evil. It'd be easy to criticize this album as just being another speed metal album that's only really important because of the aesthetics. I would say that the aesthetics are kind of the reason for the album though. Just this like overpowering atmosphere of darkness. It's campy in sort of like a satanic panic sort of way, like they were writing this shit to scare people. But it's all very well done and well written, so I don't have that many complaints. This part here is cool. Very dark. How'd you like that? And it's got sick thrash breaks on it. So despite the songs being, mostly pretty simple in construction, particularly when compared to their main band version Steele, which was edging into prog rock territory even back in 1986, it might be, simpler, a little bit more pop music oriented, but it's exceptionally well done. But more importantly, those aesthetics went on to influence a lot of much more seriously evil bands. For instance, Morbid Angel's utilization of spooky choirs sure seems almost directly inspired by the spooky choirs you just heard in that Exorcist song right there. This one's Chapel of Ghouls. It's from 1988. It's only a couple years after that Exorcist album. Some people might say, hey, this song is like older than that though, but it didn't have that spooky choir effect in it. I can tell you that in the original demo. And of course Deicide with their weird multi-track vocals, utilizing a lot of vocal effects, that kind of like spooky monster voice he's got. You can tell Glen Benton was a big fan of Exorcist. And he said as much in interviews. That's how I ended up getting into Exorcist. Here's some Jub lore. To get good at doing these kind of vocals, I used to sing along to this song in the car on the way to school, and I would do those kind of vocals not knowing that he was using all kinds of like tape warping and shit to get him that low. So there's your deep Jub lore for the evening. So it's interesting that you can pull from a fairly cheesy speed metal album like that and then push it into even more extreme territory. Virgin Steele actually ended up doing the opposite. They've actually remade a couple songs off of the Exorcist album on their later kind of like more progressive power metal material. They would take an Exorcist song and change the lyrics around a bit. This song is Call for the Exorcist, which features some wonderfully almost kind of Megadeth sounding riffs. And it's got some pretty spooky lyrics about exorcisms and vomiting and priests and witches and all that good shit. And some nasty vocals, as previously mentioned, ad infinitum. This is a great album. Even if it didn't influence a whole lot of shit, I would still say it's excellent. It's really decent spooky horror metal from the 80s. But then you can take that skeleton of that song and rework it into a pretty kick-ass power metal song almost 20 years later. At least if you're a talented enough musician. But I just think it's interesting that you got bands holding the sound in two different directions. You had all the death metal guys that went harder on the incipient death metal elements of that Exorcist album and came up with some great classics. Then you have David DeFeist, the man who did said speed metal album, going back to it years later and pulling it into this kind of like more nice vocals, more melodic heavy metal direction. It's just this like protoplasmic mess that lots of people have pulled from over the years. So that's Exorcist. It's good stuff. Good enough stuff, in fact, that on this 2-disc massive Father, Son, and Unholy Spirit reissue that just got put out, David DeFeist decided to record some new songs in the new Virgin Steele style, but harkening back to the old Exorcist shit. I mean, you can definitely tell it's just him fucking around in a home studio or whatever. Yeah, it's pretty lo-fi. It's a bit strange sounding. I don't know if I'd buy an entire album of it, but it's interesting enough. Pretty cool bonus tracks, I would say, at least. So that is the story of Exorcist's Nightmare Theater, one of the hidden gems of 80s heavy metal. Hope you liked it. I'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
From the home office in Huber Heights, this is Spooky News from CNN.com. Show is so scary, viewers nearly pass out. Holy smokers.